Welcome. This video is going to talk about organizing page content. We're going to be specifically looking at the semantic markers that were introduced in HTML5, but I also want to cover two generic elements, the div element and the span element, and then I'm going to round it out by talking about two very important attributes called the ID attribute and the class attribute. So for this video, I'm still working with the week 4 demo file from Blackboard that's out in the read folder for week 4, if you would like to follow along. So let's get started with what HTML5 brought to the table, and that is several semantic elements that helped us to organize our page and our content on our page. If I look at the top of my document, look how this demo website uses some very specific elements to define our areas of content. Let's start with a navigation element, or NAV. Typically, this is the container for our navigation. Our navigation in this case is contained inside of our header, and our header is our container for introductory materials like the logo or the web page title, or in this case our navigation element. If I scroll all the way down to the bottom of our page, you can see that our page also has a footer, and that is for our end content. You can use a footer at the end of articles and asides and headers or even nav elements as well, but in this case, this is the footer of our page. I'll scroll back up just a little bit. Notice that we have a main element. Now our main element is what sits in between our header and our footer, and this is our container for the primary content. There's only one main element that we can have per web page, and the main element cannot be a child of an article or an aside or a footer, a header, or a nav element. It can, however, contain a few elements like the aside element. This is a container for complementary content. We often use the aside element like a sidebar. We could use it to pull in quotes or some background information or some other kind of related link that might be an additional complement to the page, but isn't a requirement if it's removed. For example, if I scroll down, you can see I have an article about the Windows Explorer, and I also have an article about Firefox. Nested right in between those, there's an aside element that talks about compatibility. It's not directly necessarily related to the content, whereas if you took it out, it would impact or negatively modify our content. You can remove this aside, and the document is still going to make perfect sense. It's just complementary. The last two are going to be the section and the article. A section defines a general content area. We use this to divide up related content on our page, and often sections have headings that are associated with them. There's also the article, which is a standalone content item. You'll see articles used a lot for magazine articles or blog posts or comments, but this element, unlike the section element, must have a heading inside of it. Sections can contain articles, and articles can contain sections. They're interchangeable in that way. If you think about a newspaper has many different sections inside of it. For example, there's the sports section or opinions section. There could be a business section or a global news section. And inside each of those sections is many articles. Whereas a magazine has many articles in it. Let's say Rolling Stone is doing an article on a band. Well, that article could contain many sections, and each section is something different. Maybe there's something in there about the band, or their discography, or their tours, or something about individual members, and each one of those would be a section inside of the main article of that band. So by using all of these HTML5 semantic elements, we're really giving our page, our structure, some semantic description that helps us to organize how our page is going to be put together. So there's two more elements that I'm going to introduce in this video, and that's going to be the div element and the span element. Because unlike other elements that we've talked about before, these two elements are considered generic. Let's start with the div element. The div element is a block level element. It's like the section, but it has no semantic meaning. And the div is going to indicate a division of our content. A div doesn't have any kind of presentational properties other than it's considered a block level element, so the browser won't do anything with it once it sees that there's a div. It's up to styling in order to manipulate the div to have any other type of presentational property. Now you should only use the div element when no other block level element makes sense. You want your HTML markup to be as meaningful as possible, and the div element doesn't provide any semantic meaning to our actual HTML. For example, if I just added a random div with a heading and a couple of paragraphs, then you can see that although you can nest a div element within other div elements, you don't really want to. You can add a div element if it's necessary for your structure, or your styling, or your scripting, but if you don't need something, just don't add it. So in our case, this div has no meaning, so we wouldn't need to put it in here. I'm not going to remove it because I'm going to talk also about the span element. Now the span element is just like the div element as far as being generic, except that the span element is an inline element. We use this to indicate a word or phrase for which no inline element currently exists. There's also, just like the div element, no presentational properties that the browser associates with the span unless you purposefully add one to your styles. So I'm going to add a whole new subheading about spans, and I'm going to add a paragraph so that you could see how a span would surround just a minimal amount of content in line to another element. We're only wrapping the span around whatever we need to modify. So why would we need a span element like this? Well, let's take a look at two attributes that we could use with this span, starting with the ID attribute and then following with the class attribute. So an ID attribute is what we would use when sometimes we want to assign a unique identifier to an element. Now the key here is that we're using something unique. An ID value can only be used one time per page. We already have a couple of ID attributes in our demo web page. For example, you can see one here that says ID equals Firefox. There's also one up here called ID is equal to Explorer. And at the very top I have another one where the ID is set to Chrome. So if I have an ID equal to Chrome, then that is uniquely identifying just this article. The ID's value Chrome can only be used one time in this entire HTML document, and because an ID attribute cannot have an empty value, it has to contain at least one character, and we can't use spaces, and we always want to start with a lowercase letter, and we don't want to start with a number, and those are all coding standards that we have. We can use an ID to link specific parts of our document, and we haven't covered linking yet. We'll do that next week, but take a look at the nav element. You can see that there's a couple of anchor elements in there, and one of them has an href attribute, and it's set to the hashtag Chrome. This is an attribute that tells the link where to go when clicked on it, because it's matching the article where the ID is equal to Chrome. So when it's clicked, it takes the user to that location. When you see that pound symbol, get used to automatically thinking of it as an ID, the same way you might associate to a hashtag or a pound or a number. Start also thinking of it as ID. So because the ID is a global attribute, that means it can be applied to any element in our document. I'm going to scroll up just a little bit more, and I'm going to add an ID equal to page title to my opening H1 tag. Now remember, I can't put spaces in my ID, so I'm going to keep page and title together, and I'm going to start it with a lowercase letter. So that is the ID attribute. Now the class attribute, unlike the ID attribute, can be used as many times as you need. You remember that span that we wrote just a few moments ago? Well, now we can classify this content like it's a phone number. I'll scroll down to that information, and let's add a little bit more into our subheading. So for this part, I'm going to want to have multiple phone numbers and multiple paragraphs to demonstrate this properly. So I'm going to add 3 additional paragraphs with 3 additional span elements inside of them. Whew, look how fast video editing makes it look like I can type. Okay, now that we have all of our paragraphs and our span elements, how can we target all of those span elements with just one default value? Well, we can use this class attribute because we can reuse the class attribute over and over and over. So I'll add into each one of my span elements a class attribute, and I will set it to telephone, or TELE for short. And because I can reuse this over and over and over again, I'm going to do the same thing for each additional span element on my page. So just like the ID attribute, the class is a global attribute. That means it can be put into any element in our document. And just like the ID attribute, the class attribute cannot have an empty value. There has to be at least one character in it. But for this course, we don't want our class to contain multiple spaces or any spaces at all. This is one of our coding standards. And just as a side note, a class can contain many values, and these are delimited by a single space, which is why the name of your class can't contain spaces. So for example, let's add another paragraph For a super duper important contact and their phone number goes inside of a span, we'll also set a class equal to telephone. But this one is different because this is a super duper important contact. Well, we also want to make sure that we have other ways that we're targeting it. So we could say urgent. And we could also say large. So when I'm using this class attribute and I'm inserting spaces in between each value in that class attribute, I'm actually referring to 3 different classes: the urgent class, the large class, and that telephone class. So in this course, we don't want to use any spaces in our class. And even though we also won't use this in our class, an element can also have both an ID and a class attribute at the same time. Now this gets really useful when we get to the CSS or our presentation. Since all of the phone numbers are classified with the telephone value in it, it would be easy to style all of them at once. For example, they could all be blue or have a drop shadow. And the same can be said with an ID attribute. We can use the ID to add styles to very specific elements. So that's all I have for you in this video. And if you have any questions on any of this content, please don't hesitate to ask.